The air was thin at FOB Kestrel, a serrated knife in the lungs of the uninitiated. Anya Sharma felt it with every third step, the one where her right leg, a latticework of scarred tissue and titanium, dragged a fraction of a second too long. The gravel of the landing zone crunched under her boots, a rhythm of two solid thuds and a soft, abrasive slide. She didn't use the cane here. That was for the concrete walkways back stateside, a concession to civilian life. Here, on the roof of the world, it was a liability. More importantly, it was a symbol she refused to display. A group of young soldiers, lean and hard as the rock around them, watched her cross from the CH-47's ramp. They were part of the garrison, a quick reaction force of rangers tasked with mentoring the local militia. Their laughter, sharp and brittle in the cold, died as she drew closer. Their eyes dropped from her face, past the worn field jacket, and settled on her gait. The slight hitch, the almost imperceptible hesitation before she committed weight to her right side. It was all they needed to see. Their leader, a sergeant with a jawline that could cut steel and the name Diaz stitched over his chest, nudged his corporal. "Look what the cat dragged in," he murmured, loud enough for the wind to carry. "Recruiting from the VA hospital now." Anya kept her gaze fixed on the prefabricated building marked as the command post. She heard them. She always heard them. The whispers, the jokes, the pity that curdled into contempt. It was a familiar language, one she had learned to parse in the years since the IED had redefined her anatomy. She walked past them without a flicker of acknowledgement. Her pack settled squarely on her shoulders, its weight a familiar comfort. The scent of pine, diesel, and thin, cold air filled her senses. She catalogued it, filed it away. Inside the TOC, the air was thick with the hum of electronics and the smell of stale coffee. A colonel, his face a roadmap of desert deployments and command stress, looked up from a holographic map table. His nameplate read Madsen. His eyes were pale blue, the color of a winter sky, and just as cold. He glanced at the orders on his datapad, then at her. His gaze performed the same triangulation as his soldiers, from her face down to her unseen but heavily implied injury. "Ms. Sharma," he said, the MS. A deliberate chisel, separating her from the world of uniforms and ranks she once inhabited. "You're the new civilian trainer. Forward observation." "Yes, sir," she replied. Her voice was low, steady. It didn't waver. He gestured vaguely at the map. "This isn't a classroom at Fort Huachuca. The terrain is unforgiving. My men are a sharp end. They need trainers who can keep pace." The implication hung in the air, dense as smoke. "I understand, Colonel." "Do you?" Madsen leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "My last civilian augmentation was a retired first sergeant who thought he could still run a 6-minute mile. He blew out his knee on the first familiarization patrol. Had to medevac him. Wasted a flight window, wasted my time." Anya stood motionless. She didn't offer excuses or reassurances. She didn't mention her file, the commendations, the years spent doing things that made a 6-minute mile seem like a pleasant jog. Her file was a redacted history, a story with the most important chapters blacked out. All he would see were the bookends, a stellar recruitment score and a medical discharge. Diaz and his corporal, Levin, entered the TOC, their boots loud on the metal floor. They feigned business, grabbing a fresh battery for their radio, but their presence was deliberate. They wanted to see the new, broken toy get put in her box. "Sergeant Diaz," Madsen said, not taking his eyes off Anya. "Ms. Sharma will be attached to your unit for observation. She's here to advise on long-range surveillance techniques." Diaz shot a look at Levin, a smirk playing on his lips. "Yes, sir. We'll be sure to learn a lot." He turned to Anya. His expression a mask of professional courtesy stretched thin over a core of pure condescension. "Welcome to the team, ma'am. Try to keep up." The word ma'am was another jab, a reminder of her civilian status. She wasn't one of them. She was other. She was a woman. She was wounded. In their world, it was a trinity of liabilities. Anya simply met his gaze, her dark eyes unreadable. She gave a single, short nod. It was neither agreement nor defiance. It was simple acknowledgement. An object in motion, meeting an obstacle. For now, she would flow around it. But the pressure, she knew, would eventually build. The mountain itself would decide who had the strength to remain. The first dismissal was quiet. The next would be louder. She could already feel the barometric drop that preceded a storm. She just stood there, a silent pillar in the center of their world, letting their assumptions wash over her like a tide she had no intention of fighting. Tides, after all, always turned. Colonel Madsen made his decision that afternoon. He called her into his cramped office, the walls adorned with unit plaques and framed photos of younger, harder men. He didn't offer her a seat. He stood behind his desk, a steel fortress of authority, and held up a datapad displaying her abbreviated, unclassified file. "I've read this again, Sharma," he began, dropping them in a way that was meant to be more insulting than its use. "It's thin, very thin. It says you were an analyst. Signals intelligence." Anya remained silent. The file said what the discharge board had decided it should say. It was a neat, tidy story that explained away a complex and bloody reality. Analyst was a clean word for a dirty job. "My men are door kickers, not linguists," Madsen continued, tossing the datapad onto his desk. It clattered against a metal cup filled with pens. "They operate on instinct, aggression, and physical superiority. The long-range surveillance you're supposed to teach, they do it from the cockpit of an Apache or through the sight of a 50 calories. We don't have time for theory." "Theory saves lives, Colonel," Anya said, her voice still a low monotone. It was the first unsolicited sentence she'd offered him. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "In my experience, speed and violence of action save lives. Sitting on a hilltop for 3 days with a spotting scope just makes you a target." He steepled his fingers, his expression hardening. "Look, I'll be blunt. You're a political hire. Someone in Langley or the Pentagon wants to look good by employing wounded veterans. I respect your service, what you sacrificed. But this is an active, high-threat environment. I can't have a liability on my patrols. The terrain alone would eat you up." He was testing her, waiting for her to argue, to defend herself, to list her qualifications. He was expecting an emotional response, the kind he associated with the civilians and politicians he so clearly disdained. Anya gave him nothing. She stood with the posture of a soldier at parade rest, a discipline so ingrained it was subconscious. Her stillness seemed to unnerve him more than any argument could. "So here's what's going to happen," he said, his tone shifting to one of finality. "The training exercise with Diaz's squad is tomorrow. A 2-day patrol into the Zervan Pass. You will not be accompanying them," he paused, letting the words sink in. "Instead, you'll be assigned to the comms watch in the TOC. You can observe the exercise from the monitors. You can listen to the radio traffic. Write up a report for me on their communications discipline. It's a vital skill." It was a blatant, humiliating sidelining. He was putting the forward observation expert in a dark room 100 kilometers from the field and telling her to listen to the radio. It was a job for a private fresh out of basic training. Diaz and his squad would be out there doing the work, and she would be a glorified secretary. "Is that understood?" Madsen asked, his voice sharp. "Crystal, Colonel," Anya replied. The military jargon slipped out, a ghost of her former life. It hung in the air between them. He raised an eyebrow. "Good. We have our first lesson. Know your role, know your limitations." He picked up the datapad again, a clear dismissal. Anya turned and walked out. As the office door closed behind her, she heard him speak into his comms unit. "Diaz, get in here." She walked back into the main operations center. The holographic map still glowed, depicting the jagged peaks and deep valleys of the surrounding region. The Zervan Pass was a thin, treacherous line of green snaking through a sea of red topographical lines. She traced its path with her eyes, her mind automatically calculating fields of fire, ambush points, dead zones for communication. She noted the prevailing winds, the time of the coming sunset, the likely temperature drop after nightfall. Levin and another soldier, Chen, were prepping their gear near the exit. They saw her looking at the map and exchanged a look. "Don't worry, ma'am," Levin said with a patronizing grin. "We'll take good pictures for your report." Chen snickered. "Yeah, maybe we can get you a live feed, so you can feel like you're really there." Anya ignored them. Her focus was on the map. She saw a flaw in the patrol route, a subtle but critical misjudgment of the terrain. The planned route followed a riverbed for the first 5 kilometers, offering cover from above but creating a perfect, inescapable channel for an ambush. It was a textbook mistake, something a first-year cadet would be taught to avoid. Madsen's rigid, conventional planning was evident in every straight line and right angle. He was treating the mountain like a grid on a map, not a living, breathing entity that killed the careless. She could have gone back to his office. She could have pointed it out, cited doctrine, argued her case. But she knew it would be futile. They saw her as broken. They would interpret her warning as fear, her expertise as academic nonsense. They had dismissed her so completely that her words would be nothing more than air. So she said nothing. She turned from the glowing map and walked towards the small barracks assigned to civilian contractors. She moved with her steady, rhythmic limp, the sound a quiet metronome counting down the hours until the patrol left. They had put her in a box. Soon, they would find out she was the one who had written the book on how to think outside of it. The crisis began not with a bang, but with a crackle of static. Anya sat in the dimly lit TOC, a headset on, listening to the rhythmic breathing of Sergeant Diaz and the occasional board check-in from his squad. On the main screen, a drone feed showed a grainy, green-tinted view of Diaz's men moving through the riverbed she had identified as a fatal funnel. The sky above them was a star-dusted blanket of obsidian. Colonel Madsen was in his office, confident in his plan and his men. Anya was the only one paying attention. The patrol was making good time. Too good. They were moving with the arrogant confidence of a unit that believed it owned the night. They weren't checking the high ground. Their flank security was lazy. Anya felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She could see the ambush before it happened, a ghost image superimposed on the drone feed. She saw the shape of the rocks that were perfect for concealed machine gun nests, the bend in the river that would trap them in a crossfire. She reached for the comms panel, her fingers hovering over the transmit button to Diaz's squad channel. She could warn them, but what would she say? "This is the broken analyst in the TOC. Your patrol route is a death trap," they would laugh. Madsen would have her on the next flight out for breaking chain of command. Her hand dropped. She was a Cassandra in a world that had already decided she was a liar. Then it came. A single, sharp crackle in her headset, followed by a garbled shout from Levin. "Contact! Contact left!" The drone feed flared white as a muzzle flash erupted from the rocks above the riverbed. Then another and another. The green figures on the screen scattered, diving for non-existent cover. The air filled with the panicked, overlapping shouts of the squad. "Where is it coming from? I'm hit. Chen's hit. Diaz, we're pinned." On the tactical map, their icons, once a neat, orderly line, became a frantic, chaotic cluster. Then, a deep, concussive whump shook the entire FOB. The lights flickered, and half the screens in the TOC went dark. A secondary explosion, closer this time, blew the main door off its hinges, sending a shower of sparks and debris into the room. The drone feed died. The comms channel dissolved into a wall of white noise. "What the hell was that?" Madsen yelled, bursting out of his office. "Report!" A communications tech, a young specialist with terror in his eyes, frantically tapped at his console. "Sir, multiple impacts on the northern perimeter. The comms tower is down. We've lost all long-range communication." The FOB's general quarters alarm began to blare, a synthetic, soulless scream. The sounds of distant, heavy machine gun fire joined the chorus. This wasn't a simple ambush on a patrol. This was a coordinated, complex attack. They had been watching, waiting, and they had chosen their moment perfectly. Madsen grabbed a radio, trying to raise Diaz's squad. Havoc 1, this is Kestrel 6, how copy? Havoc 1. Respond. Only static answered. He slammed the radio down on the console. His by-the-book certainty had evaporated, replaced by the raw, primal fear of a commander who had lost control. He started barking orders, but they were reflexive, useless. Get a perimeter. Get me a sitrep. Someone get me eyes on that pass. The remaining soldiers in the TOC scrambled, some grabbing rifles, others trying to reboot dead systems. Their training was for conventional threats, for overwhelming firepower and air support. They were not prepared for being deaf, blind, and surrounded. The rigid system had shattered at the first impact. In the midst of the chaos, Anya moved with a preternatural calm. She slid off the headset and stood up. The power outage had killed most of the lights, plunging the TOC into a murky gloom, illuminated only by the red glow of emergency lighting and the flickering fires outside. The others were shadows, panicked and frantic. She was a pillar of stillness. She didn't run to a console or grab a radio. She walked over to the large, old-fashioned paper map of the region pinned to a corkboard, a relic no one ever looked at. With a grease pencil, she drew a small X where Diaz's squad had gone silent. She then drew a series of concentric circles around the FOB, marking likely enemy mortar positions based on the impact craters she had glimpsed through the broken doorway. Her movements were economical, precise. Madsen, seeing her, stormed over. "What are you doing? I need solutions, not arts and crafts." Anya didn't look at him. She tapped the X in the Zervan pass. "Your squad isn't pinned down, Colonel. They're in a kill box. The enemy isn't trying to suppress them. They're hurting them. There will be an RGL team or a minefield at the northern end of the gorge. That's the backstop. The machine guns on the ridges are just the flankers." She then tapped the circles she had drawn around the FOB. "These mortar positions are not random. They are targeting command and control and the motor pool. They're not trying to overrun us. Not yet. They're trying to isolate us. To fix us in place." She finally turned to look at him, her eyes holding his in the red gloom. "They are isolating you so they can annihilate your squad. This whole attack on the FOB is a feint." Her assessment was so swift, so certain, it cut through Madsen's panic like a surgeon's scalpel. He stared at her, then at the map. The brutal logic of her words was undeniable. He had sent his men into a perfectly designed trap, and the architects of that trap were now ensuring he couldn't do a thing to help them. His arrogance, his dismissal, his certainty, it had all just signed the death warrant for his men. And the one person who had been in a position to see it coming was the woman he had relegated to making coffee and listening to the radio. The crisis was no longer just on the mountain. It was in this room, standing between a failed commander and the wounded woman he had so thoroughly underestimated. The choice was not a choice. It was an inevitability. While Madsen stood frozen by the map, paralyzed by the sheer scope of his failure, Anya acted. She moved past him, her limp more pronounced now, a steady, determined rhythm on the debris-strewn floor. She went to the arms rack, a place the soldiers had eyed her with suspicion for even looking at. She bypassed the standard M4S, her hands running over stocks and barrels with an expert familiarity that was unnerving. She found what she was looking for at the far end, a forgotten M110, a semi-automatic sniper system left behind by a Marine Scout sniper team that had rotated out months ago. It was coated in a fine layer of dust. She picked it up. The weight settled into her shoulder and hands like an old, remembered friend. She worked the action, the sound a solid, metallic clack that cut through the noise of the TOC. It was a sound of purpose. She found a crate of 762mm match-grade ammunition and began methodically loading magazines, her fingers moving with a deftness that defied their slender appearance. Each round seeded with a soft click. Click, 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 a rosary of death. A young private, his face pale and smudged with soot, watched her. "What are you doing, ma'am?" The colonel said to hold the perimeter. "The colonel is trying to save the fort," Anya said without looking up from her task. "I'm going to save his men." She slung the rifle over her shoulder and grabbed a go-bag from under a desk, one she had packed herself the day she arrived. It wasn't standard issue. It was light, containing only the essentials: water, a trauma kit, a thermal blanket, a set of high-powered binoculars, and 3 extra magazines for the rifle. She walked to the broken doorway, the chaos of the FOB unfolding before her. Small arms fire stitched across the compound. A Humvee was burning, casting flickering, monstrous shadows. Madsen finally snapped out of his stupor. "Sharma, where do you think you're going? I didn't give you an order." Anya paused at the threshold, half in the red light of the TOC, half in the firelit darkness of the night. She turned her head slightly, her profile sharp and resolute. "You're right, sir. You didn't," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of insubordination or emotion. It was simply a statement of fact. "But they're your men, and I'm the only one who knows how to get them out." Before he could respond, she slipped out into the night, vanishing into the smoke and shadows. She didn't run. She moved with a strange, flowing gait, using her injured leg not as a hindrance but as a pivot point, allowing her to change direction with an unnatural quickness. She flowed between containers and wrecked vehicles, the gunfire and explosions seeming to part around her. Her mind was a cold, clear lake. The pain in her leg was a distant hum, a background noise she had long ago learned to ignore. All that mattered was the geometry of the problem. Diaz and his men were the variable X. The enemy was a complex equation of terrain, firepower, and intent. Her role was to solve for X. She made her way to the western edge of the FOB, the side that faced the steep, almost sheer cliffs leading up towards the Zervan Pass. It was the one area the enemy wasn't focused on, assuming it to be impassable. For a soldier with 2 good legs, it would have been a suicidal climb. For Anya, it was just a different kind of problem. She found a deep fissure in the rock, a place where spring meltwater had carved a jagged scar up the mountainside. She holstered the rifle across her back, securing it tightly. Then she began to climb. Her hands, strong and calloused, found holds that were barely there. She used her good leg for power, driving herself upward, and her injured leg for balance and stability, wedging it into cracks. She moved like a spider, a slow, methodical ascent. Every movement was deliberate. There was no wasted energy, no fear, just a relentless, upward progress. Pain flared in her hip and knee, sharp and electric. She breathed through it. She knew this pain. It was an old companion. It told her where her limits were, and she had spent years learning to push past them. The wind howled around her, plucking at her jacket, trying to tear her from the rock face. The sounds of the battle below faded, replaced by the rasp of her own breathing and the scrape of her boots on stone. Halfway up, she paused, anchoring herself to a small ledge. She pulled out her binoculars and scanned the valley below. Through the powerful lenses, the chaos resolved into patterns. She saw the muzzle flashes from the enemy machine gun nests on the ridges overlooking the riverbed. 2 of them, just as she'd predicted. They were pouring fire into the gorge, keeping Diaz's squad pinned. She scanned further up the pass, to the north, and her breath caught. A flicker of movement. She adjusted the focus. 3 men setting up an RPG. The backstop. She now had the full picture. The trap was sprung. Diaz and his men were caught between the hammer of the machine guns and the anvil of the RPG team. They had maybe 10 minutes before they were systematically annihilated. Anya put the binoculars away. She checked the rifle on her back. 10 minutes. It was a lifetime. She continued to climb, faster now, the knowledge of the closing trap lending a desperate urgency to her movements. The rock tore at her gloves, her knuckles raw and bleeding. The cold bit at her exposed skin. She didn't notice. Her world had narrowed to the next handhold, the next foothold, the next meter of vertical ascent. She wasn't a wounded veteran anymore. She wasn't a civilian contractor. She was a weapon moving to a firing position. And the mountain was her ally. She reached the ridge an hour later, pulling herself over the final lip of rock with a grunt, her muscles screaming in protest. She was high above the battle, on a rocky outcrop that gave her a commanding view of the entire pass. Below her, the riverbed was a ribbon of darkness, sporadically illuminated by tracer fire. She could see the two enemy machine gun nests, marked by the rhythmic flashes of their guns. Further north, she could just make out the RPG team, taking their time, confident their prey was trapped. Anya didn't waste a moment. She unslung the M110, her movements fluid and economical despite her exhaustion. She found a stable firing position, a shallow depression in the rock that gave her both cover and a clear line of sight. She deployed the rifle's bipod, the small metal legs clicking into place. She chambered around, the sound swallowed by the wind. She settled behind the scope, her breathing slowing, her heartbeat a steady drum. The world outside the circular lens vanished. There was only the target picture. The pain in her leg, the burning in her lungs, the cold seeping into her bones. It all faded away. This was her sanctuary, the place where the chaos of the world resolved into a simple, pure problem of ballistics and windage. Her first target was the western machine gun nest. It was approximately 800 meters away, a difficult shot in daylight, a near impossible one at night with a gusting crosswind. She watched the tracer fire, using it to read the wind's invisible currents. She adjusted the scope's elevation and windage knobs, the clicks precise and deliberate. Her mind was a supercomputer calculating drop, spin, drift, air density. She exhaled, her breath pluming in the cold air. At the bottom of her breath, in the still, quiet moment between heartbeats, she squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a familiar, comforting punch. The report of the shot was a sharp crack, immediately snatched away by the wind. For a second, nothing happened. Then, through the scope, she saw the stream of tracers from the western nest abruptly cease. The gunner, a dark shape behind the weapon, slumped forward and disappeared. The assistant gunner, confused, stood up to see what was wrong, and Anya sent a second round, almost without thinking, that threw him backward off the ledge. One nest down. The second machine gun crew, realizing what had happened, began firing frantically in her general direction, their tracers arcing wildly into the darkness. They were panicked. Good. Anya shifted her position, crawling 20 meters to her left. They were shooting at a memory. She acquired the second nest. This one was further, closer to 950 meters. The angle was steeper. She made her adjustments, her fingers moving with an ingrained certainty. She took another breath, let it out, and fired. The gun went silent. The threat from the ridges was neutralized. Now for the RPG team. They were 1,000 meters away, at the edge of the rifle's effective range. They had seen the machine guns go silent and were now hurrying to get their rocket into the tube, realizing their window of opportunity was closing. Anya took 3 quick, calming breaths. This was the most critical shot. It wasn't just about killing the enemy. It was about sending a message to Diaz's squad. A message of hope. She put the crosshairs on the man holding the RPG launcher. She factored in the wind, the distance, the upward angle of the shot. She held her breath, her focus absolute. The world narrowed to the few inches of the scope, the man's silhouette a dark shape against the slightly less dark rock face. She fired. Down in the gorge, Sergeant Diaz was preparing to die. Chun was dead. Levin was bleeding from a shrapnel wound to his leg. They were down to their last magazines, trapped in a shallow bend of the river with nowhere to go. The machine guns on the ridges had pinned them for what felt like an eternity. Then, impossibly, the guns had stopped. First one, then the other. For a glorious minute, there was silence. Then, from the north end of the pass, he heard shouting. The backstop, the RPG team. They were out of the frying pan and into the fire. "This is it," he muttered to Levin, trying to stop the bleeding from his leg. "Get ready to charge them. We die on our feet." Levin, pale and shaking, just nodded, gripping his rifle. Suddenly, a sound echoed down the pass. A single, sharp crack, different from the enemy's AKs. It was a heavy, authoritative sound. A moment later, 1,000 meters up the pass, the figure holding the RPG launcher was violently slammed backward, as if struck by an invisible truck. The rocket he was loading clattered to the ground. His two comrades stared in disbelief for a second before a second crack echoed, and another one of them fell. The last man dropped his weapon and scrambled away into the darkness, his terror a palpable thing even at this distance. Silence descended again, this time a heavy, profound silence. Diaz and his men looked at each other, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning hope. It wasn't their air support. There had been no sound of jets or helicopters. It wasn't an allied unit. They were the only ones in this sector. The shots had come from the high ground, from the impassable cliffs to the west. From nowhere. "Who the hell is that?" Levin whispered, his voice filled with awe. Diaz didn't have an answer. He keyed his radio, his hand shaking. "All Kestrel elements, this is Havoc 1. We have an angel on the high ground. I repeat, we have an unknown friendly sniper providing support. The threat is neutralized." Back in the TOC, Madsen and the others had managed to get a backup generator running, restoring power to a single comms console. They had been listening to the frantic, hopeless calls from Diaz's squad, then the terrifying silence. They heard Diaz's last report, his voice choked with emotion. An angel on the high ground. Madsen stared at the paper map on the wall, at the X marking his squad's last known position. And then he looked at the sheer, impossible cliffs to the west. His eyes widened as a horrifying, unbelievable realization dawned on him. He remembered the dust-covered M110 missing from the wreck. He remembered the quiet, wounded woman who had walked out into the fire. He grabbed the radio from the tech. "Havoc 1, be advised. I think your angel is our civilian contractor." The silence on the other end of the radio was more eloquent than any words. Diaz, pinned down and bleeding, tried to process the information. The woman with the limp, the analyst, the one they had mocked and dismissed? It was impossible. A new voice came over the channel, cutting through Diaz's stunned silence. It was calm, low, and completely steady. "Havoc 1, this is Overwatch. I have you in sight. The immediate threat is neutralized, but you have another enemy squad moving on your position from the south, using the riverbed for cover. They'll be on you in 5 mics. You need to move. Now, your exfil route is east, up the scree slope. Steep, but it will get you out of the funnel. Move now. I will cover your withdrawal." It was Sharma's voice. There was no emotion in it. No, I told you so. Just a clear, concise set of instructions. A voice of pure, distilled competence. Diaz stared at the eastern slope. It looked impossibly steep, but he had just witnessed the impossible. "You heard her," he yelled at his remaining men. "Move. Levin, I've got you." He hoisted the wounded corporal onto his shoulder, and they began to scramble up the loose rock of the scree slope, away from the death trap below. As they climbed, they heard the sounds of the approaching enemy squad entering the gorge. A moment later, the authoritative crack of the sniper rifle echoed from the cliffs again. And again. Anya was holding the back door for them. She was a ghost on the mountain, a guardian angel with a 762mm rifle, and she was buying them their lives, one perfectly placed round at a time. The retreat was a brutal, lung-searing ordeal. Diaz, half-carrying Levin, led the 2 other remaining members of his squad up the scree slope. Below them, in the dark riverbed, Anya's rifle continued its methodical work. Each shot was a punctuation mark in the night, a period at the end of an enemy soldier's life. They didn't hear firefights, just single, deliberate cracks, followed by screams that were quickly silenced. She wasn't just suppressing the enemy, she was dismantling them. Diaz and his men finally crested the slope, collapsing onto a narrow ridge, their chests heaving. They were exposed, but they were out of the kill box. Diaz keyed his radio, his voice a ragged gasp. "Overwatch. Havoc 1 is on the eastern ridge. We're clear." "Negative, Havoc 1. Sharma's voice came back instantly, still unervingly calm. "You are silhouetted against the sky. Get down. Crawl 200 meters north to the cluster of pine trees. It is a defensible position. I will meet you there. There was no argument. The tone of command was absolute. Diaz and his men did as they were told, crawling on their bellies through the dirt and rock until they reached the small, dark copse of trees. They formed a hasty perimeter, their rifles pointed out into the oppressive darkness, their nerves frayed. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching footsteps. They waited for what felt like an eternity. Then, a shadow detached itself from another shadow. Anya emerged from the darkness, moving with a silence that defied belief. The M110 was slung across her back. She wasn't even breathing heavily. She surveyed their position with a critical eye, then knelt beside Levin, pulling the trauma kit from her go-bag. "Pressure dressing isn't tight enough," she said, her voice a low murmur. Her fingers, nimble and sure, cut away Levin's blood-soaked pants leg. The shrapnel wound was ugly. Without wasting emotion, she applied a tourniquet high on his thigh, cinching it tight with a practiced twist. She packed the wound with hemostatic gauze, her movements efficient and detached, like a mechanic working on a broken engine. Levin hissed in pain but didn't cry out. He just stared at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of agony and awe. Diaz watched her, speechless. This was not the broken woman from the FOB. This was something else entirely, something ancient and dangerous. "How?" he finally managed to ask. "How did you do that? That climb? Those shots?" Anya finished securing the bandage on Levin's leg and looked up at Diaz. In the faint starlight, her face was a pale, emotionless mask. "The mission is not over, Sergeant." She stood up, her knee making a soft popping sound. She ignored it. The attack on the FOB was a fixing force. This was their main effort. They wanted your squad or what they thought was your squad. High-value targets. "We're just a QRF team," Diaz said, confused. "That's what you are today," Anya replied, her gaze distant. "But they have old intelligence. 5 years ago, this FOB was a black site, a CIA staging ground for cross-border operations. The unit that ran it was called Task Force Nomad." A chill went down Diaz's spine. Task Force Nomad was a ghost story, a legend operators told around campfires. A small, deniable unit of assassins and spies that had terrorized insurgent leadership for a decade before vanishing from the official records. "The intel must have been a ghost," Anya continued, scanning the darkness. "But it was enough to convince this new warlord to make a name for himself. He thought he was bagging a team of high-value operators. He threw his best fighters at you," she paused. "And they are still out there. They're regrouping. They'll hunt us till dawn." The full weight of their situation settled on the small group. They were alone, miles from the besieged FOB, with wounded, low on ammo, and hunted by a superior force. It was in that moment of despair that the radio crackled again. It was Colonel Madsen. His voice was strained, heavy with the weight of command under siege. "Kestrel 6 to any friendly element in Zervan Pass. Sitrep, over." Diaz was about to answer, but Anya held up a hand, stopping him. She took the radio from him. "Kestrel 6, this is Overwatch. I have Havoc 1. For survivors, 1 wounded. We are currently evading. The enemy force is estimated at 2 platoons, well-equipped and motivated. They are actively hunting us." There was a long pause from Madsen's end. When he spoke again, his voice was different. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a desperate plea for competence. "Overwatch, what are your intentions? What do you need?" "I need you to hold the FOB," Anya said. "At dawn, I need you to have a medevac bird on standby. But do not send it until you hear from me. They will be waiting for it." "Understood," Madsen said. "But who are you, Overwatch? What is your full call sign?" "HQ is screaming at me. They're trying to get a satellite feed, but they need authorization. They need to know who is running this operation." Anya was silent for a moment. She looked at the faces of the young soldiers around her, their survival now resting squarely on her shoulders. She looked out into the vast, hostile darkness. The past was a ghost, but sometimes you had to let it speak. My credentials are on file, she said, her voice dropping even lower, colder. Service number 7545912. Authorization code, Viper Actual. The silence from the radio was absolute. It stretched for 10 seconds, then 20. In the TOC, Madsen stared at the radio as if it had turned into a snake. The young comms tech's eyes were wide. He had been a child when that authorization code was last used, but he had heard the stories in training. It was a code that unlocked everything. A code that meant a ghost was walking the earth. Finally, a new voice came over the command channel, overriding Madsen completely. It was a voice that carried the weight of stars on its collar, a voice from a satellite phone link at CENTCOM, a voice that should not have been monitoring a local skirmish. Viper Actual, this is Sun God. We read you 5 by 5. Stand by. The voice was sharp, alert, and laced with something that sounded like disbelief. A few seconds passed. Christ. It is you. The professionalism dropped for just a second. Okay. Viper Actual, the board is green. All assets are yours. I repeat, all theater assets are at your disposal. What do you require? In the small copse of trees on that dark mountain, Diaz and his men stared at Anya. She was no longer Ms. Sharma, the wounded analyst. The name on the radio, Viper Actual, felt wrong. Too formal. Diaz remembered a briefing he'd had years ago, as a young ranger private, about high-value targets in this very region. There was a slide with a heavily redacted file. A sniper team that had operated with impunity, racking up a kill count that was classified at the highest levels. The instructor had called them myths. He remembered the call sign of the spotter. And he remembered the call sign of the shooter, a name whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence. A name that meant certain death from a place you never saw. He looked at Anya, at her calm demeanor, her impossible skill, the way she seemed to be part of the mountain itself. The pieces clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. Ghost Viper, Diaz whispered, the name leaving his lips without his permission. Anya's head snapped towards him. Her eyes, for the first time, showed a flicker of something other than cold focus. It wasn't anger. It was a deep, profound weariness. The ghost was out. The name was spoken. The other two soldiers, hearing the name, looked at each other, their faces pale. The legend was real, and she was standing right in front of them. The mockery, the jokes, the dismissal. It all curdled into a deep, gut-wrenching shame. They hadn't just underestimated a civilian contractor. They had mocked a living legend, a titan from a more brutal and heroic age of their own profession. They had been children throwing stones at a monument. Anya held Diaz's gaze for a second longer, then turned back to the radio, her composure returning like a mask being lowered into place. The moment of revelation was over. The work remained. Sun God, this is Ghost Viper, she said, her voice now pure ice. I require a full sensor sweep of Grid 4-7 Alpha. I need to know the exact disposition of the enemy forces between my position and the exfil point. And I want a Predator drone on station but weapons cold. I only need its eyes. I will handle the rest myself. There was no hesitation from the other end. Copy, Ghost Viper. Predator is en route. You'll have eyes in 10 mics. Good hunting. The radio went silent. Anya handed it back to Diaz. The dynamic had shifted, a tectonic plate of respect moving into place. She was no longer their attachment. They were her assets. Diaz looked down at the radio in his hand, then back up at her, his expression one of complete, unconditional submission to her authority. He was a sergeant, a leader of rangers. But in the presence of a Ghost Viper, he was a student. What are your orders, ma'am? He asked. The ma'am no longer a sarcastic barb but a mark of profound respect. Anya pointed north, into the darkness. We move. The enemy thinks we'll run for the FOB. We're going to do the opposite. We're going deeper into their territory. We're going to find their command element and cut the head off the snake. She turned and began to move, her limp the only sound in the night. It was no longer a sign of weakness. It was the steady, rhythmic beat of a hunter on the prowl. Diaz and his men checked their weapons, shared a look of grim determination, and followed her into the darkness without a single word of doubt. They were following the ghost viper, and no one who followed her had ever been lost. The transformation in the squad was absolute. Every ounce of their previous arrogance had been scoured away, replaced by a quiet, focused intensity. They moved behind Anya in a diamond formation, their footfalls soft, their weapons at the ready. They were her flock, and she was the shepherd, leading them through the valley of death. Her limp was their metronome, a steady beat they timed their own movements to. Thud, thud, slide, thud, thud, slide. It was the sound of survival. Anya had the feed from the Predator drone piped directly to a small, wrist-mounted display she had taken from her go-bag. The grainy thermal image showed the enemy forces, glowing white hotspots moving through the dark. They were exactly where she expected them to be, sweeping the area between the ambush site and the FOB, their movements predictable, conventional. They were hunting a rabbit, not realizing they had cornered a wolf. Two-man team, 100 meters, you're 11 o'clock, she whispered into her throat mic, which was patched into the squad's frequency. In the rocks. Let them pass. Diaz relayed the order with hand signals. The squad melted into the shadows, becoming part of the landscape. The two enemy fighters moved past their position, completely oblivious. Diaz felt a cold sweat on his brow. On his own, he would have engaged them, starting a firefight that would have brought the entire enemy force down on them. Anya's patience was unnerving. It was the patience of a predator that knows its superiority. They moved for 2 hours, a slow, painstaking infiltration deeper into the mountains. Anya led them along goat trails and shadowed ravines, routes that didn't appear on any map. She seemed to read the terrain as if it were a book written in a language only she understood. She paused every 100 meters, her head cocked, listening, smelling the air. She was part of the wilderness. The drone feed showed her what she was looking for. A small, sheltered encampment in a box canyon. A command tent, a communications antenna, and a larger group of fighters gathered around a fire. The warlord himself. He had come to watch his glorious victory. There, Anya whispered, pointing her chin towards a high ridge overlooking the canyon. That's our position. The climb was steep and treacherous. At one point, Levin's wounded leg gave out, and he sent a small cascade of pebbles clattering down the mountainside. The squad froze. Below, the enemy fighters stirred, one of them pointing up into the darkness. Before Diaz could even react, Anya had moved back to Levin. She didn't say a word. She simply unslung her own rifle, handed it to him, and then hoisted his arm over her shoulder. She took most of his weight, her own injured leg trembling under the strain, and continued the climb, half dragging him up the rock face. The muscles in her jaw were corded with effort, but she made no sound. The message was clear. No one gets left behind. Not on her watch. They reached the firing position just as the first hint of dawn began to soften the eastern sky. It was a perfect sniper's perch, a natural nest of rock that offered a clear, 1,200-meter shot down into the canyon. Diaz and his men established a security perimeter while Anya set up the M110. She worked with the quiet reverence of a priest preparing for a service. She checked the rifle's zero, cleaned the lens of the scope, laid out her extra magazines on a small cloth. She took a reading from a Kestrel wind meter, her lips moving as she calculated the complex firing solution. Diaz crawled up beside her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, "what's the plan?" Anya didn't look at him. Her eye was already pressed to the scope. "The warlord is in that tent. The man with the red scarf. His 2 lieutenants are the ones by the fire drinking tea. The radio operator is the one who keeps looking at the sky, waiting for a signal that will never come. For targets. For rounds. When they fall, the rest of the fighters will break. We can call in an airstrike," Diaz offered. "The Predator is still on station. We can have a hellfire in there in 30 seconds. Anya finally turned to look at him, her eye pulling away from the scope. Her gaze was intense. "An airstrike is loud. It's messy. Tells the world we were here. creates martyrs. She looked back through the scope. This is a message. It's quiet. It's personal. It tells them that no matter where they hide, no matter how deep in the mountains they go, the ghosts will find them. Creates fear. And fear is a much more effective weapon than a bomb. She settled back behind the rifle. Get ready, she said. As soon as I fire, they'll panic. Some will run, some will fight. Shoot the ones who fight. Let the others run. They will carry the story. They will spread the fear. Diaz nodded, a profound understanding dawning on him. She wasn't just winning a battle. She was ending a war before it could begin. He crawled back to his men and relayed the orders. The sun crested the horizon, bathing the peaks in a brilliant, alpine glow. Down in the canyon, the warlord emerged from his tent, stretching in the morning sun. Anya's voice came over the comms, a soft, final whisper. Targets acquired. Sending. The M110 cracked, the sound sharp in the thin morning air. Through his binoculars, Diaz saw the warlord collapse as if his strings had been cut. Crack. One of the lieutenants by the fire dropped his teacup and fell forward into the embers. Crack. The second lieutenant clutched his chest and spun to the ground. Crack. The radio operator slumped over his console, his headset falling from his head. 4 shots in less than 10 seconds, all from over a kilometer away, all perfect. For a moment, the encampment was frozen in confusion. Then chaos erupted. Anya's prediction was uncannily accurate. Half the fighters dropped their weapons and fled, screaming, into the mountains. The other half, the hardcore loyalists, grabbed their rifles and started firing wildly up at the ridges. Engage, Anya said calmly. Diaz and his men opened fire. Their shots were no longer the panicked bursts of a trapped squad, but the disciplined, aimed fire of professional soldiers with a clear purpose. They worked in concert with Anya's rifle, which continued to speak from the ridge, each shot finding a target with lethal precision. The firefight was over in 3 minutes. The enemy was broken. Anya's voice came over the radio. Kestrel 6, this is Ghost Viper. The package is secure. Send the bus. LZ coordinates to follow. An hour later, the survivors stood on a flat, rocky outcrop, the rising sun warming their faces. They were exhausted, filthy, and bloodied, but they were alive. In the distance, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of inbound Black Hawk helicopters grew steadily louder. Levin sat propped against a rock, his leg bandaged. The other 2 rangers stood nearby, cleaning their weapons, their movements now mirroring the same methodical precision they had witnessed in Anya. Diaz walked over to where Anya stood, staring out at the vast mountain range. The M110 was slung on her back. She looked smaller in the daylight, more human. But he knew that was an illusion. No one would have believed it, he said, more to himself than to her. Anya didn't respond. She just watched the approaching helicopters. Thank you, Diaz said, the words feeling inadequate. You saved us. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. You saved yourselves, Sergeant. You followed orders. You adapted. You survived. She gave him a slight, almost imperceptible nod. You'll make a fine leader one day. Coming from her, it was the highest praise he had ever received. He felt a lump form in his throat and simply nodded in return. The helicopters landed in a swirl of dust and wind. The ramp dropped and Colonel Madsen was the first one off. He was still wearing the same stained uniform from the night before. His face was etched with exhaustion and relief. His eyes scanned the small group and found Anya. He walked directly to her, his boots crunching on the gravel. The Rangers, including Diaz, instinctively straightened up, expecting a confrontation, ready to defend her. Madsen stopped a foot in front of her. He looked at the legendary rifle on her back, at the smudges of dirt and cordite on her face, at the steady, unwavering gaze in her eyes. He saw the wounded woman he had dismissed, and he saw the apex predator that lived inside her. He didn't say a word. He didn't offer an apology or an explanation. Actions, not words, were the currency of their world. In the quiet of the morning, Surrounded by the towering peaks she had just conquered, Colonel Madsen brought his hand up in a crisp, formal salute. It wasn't the salute a superior gives a subordinate. It was the salute of a soldier to a soldier, a mark of ultimate earned respect. Anya held his gaze for a long moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she returned the salute. It was just as sharp, just as precise. A gesture that acknowledged his apology and accepted it, all without a single word. The sun was high now, a brilliant disk in the cobalt sky. Back at FOB Kestrel, in the quiet of her small, Spartan room, Anya sat on the edge of her cot. The M110 was laid out on a cleaning mat, its constituent parts arranged in a precise geometric pattern. Her cane, the one she hadn't used, leaned against the wall in the corner, a forgotten artifact from another life. She worked methodically, her hands moving with an old, familiar grace. She dipped a brush in solvent, scrubbing the carbon from the bolt carrier group. The metallic, chemical smell filled the small room. It was a familiar incense. She wasn't thinking about the battle or the praise, or the looks of awe from the soldiers she passed on her way back from the landing zone. She wasn't thinking about Madsen's salute or Diaz's humbled gratitude. She was focused only on the task at hand, the precise, mechanical process of cleaning her tool. Each part was wiped down, oiled, and inspected. Each spring, each pin, each lever. It was a ritual, a meditation, a way of bringing order to a world of chaos. A way of cleaning not just the rifle, but her own mind, scrubbing away the blood and the noise, leaving only the quiet hum of purpose. She finished the reassembly, working the action to ensure it was smooth. The rifle was whole again, clean, ready. She stood up, her right leg protesting with a dull ache. She walked to the window and looked out. The sun was glinting off the jagged peaks of the Zervan Pass. They looked peaceful now, beautiful, belying the violence they had witnessed. They were just mountains, just rock and ice and wind. They didn't care about heroes or ghosts. They simply endured. Anya picked up the rifle and placed it carefully in its case. The work was done. For today. She stood for a moment in the silence of her room, a solitary figure against the vast, unforgiving landscape. The ghost was back in its box. The viper was coiled, at rest, waiting.